The northern coast of Anatolia is a place of shadows and silver light. Mountains rise straight from the sea, their peaks lost in clouds, their valleys echoing with the sound of hidden rivers. To travelers, it seems a land apart, a world forgotten, where roads bend toward mystery. Long ago, these cliffs looked down upon a kingdom. Its kings spoke in many tongues, prayed to many gods, ruled from palaces carved into living rock. Between the sea and the highlands, they built a nation of two souls, half Eastern, half Greek, and they dreamed of uniting the world between them. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his empire cracked like glass. It had stretched from Macedon to the Indus, held together by his will alone. And when that will dissolved, so did the illusion of unity. Generals who had once sworn oaths of loyalty now gathered armies of their own, carving dominions from the wreckage. Asia Minor became their battlefield, where ambition burned brighter than loyalty, and the ground itself seemed weary of crowns. Amid this turmoil, one Persian satrap watched the storm unfold and understood that survival required distance. Mithridates, the founder, a noble who had served under Antigonus the One-Eyed, had no illusions about the mercy of conquerors. He had seen enough of Alexander's successors to know that each victory only bred the next betrayal. Around 302 BC, while his peers plotted for thrones, Mithridates vanished northward with his family and a handful of loyal followers. They crossed the Halys River and entered a land the Greeks called Pontus, a narrow, wind-scoured strip between the Pariadres Mountains and the Black Sea. There, where the forests met the sea mist, he began again. Pontus was a kingdom shaped by its geography. The mountains shielded it from the plateaus of Cappadocia. The Black Sea guarded its northern frontier with storms. The rivers Iris and Lycus carved fertile valleys through the hills, feeding a people who knew how to wrest life from difficult soil. It was not a rich land by the standards of empires, but it was defensible and it was forgotten. From that obscurity, Mithridates built something enduring. He founded his capital at Amasia, high above the Iris River. The city rose directly from the stone, a citadel of terraces, temples, and tombs carved into cliffs that glowed red at sunset. There he proclaimed himself king, not as usurper, but as restorer. To the Persians who followed him, he invoked the lineage of Cyrus and Darius. To the Greeks who traded along the coast, he promised the order of Hellenic governance. Two audiences, two truths, one purpose, legitimacy. His rule was born not of conquest, but of synthesis. In the markets of Amasia, merchants heard prayers spoken in both Greek and Persian. Shrines to Zeus rose beside altars to Ahura Mazda. The new king minted coins showing his profile, half Hellenic ideal, half Persian noble, and sent them through the ports of Sinope, Amissos, and Trapezus. Each coin was a message. Pontus existed, and Pontus endured. The world beyond could fight itself into exhaustion. The Black Sea would remain his moat, the mountains his wall. The wars of the Diadochi raged on. In 301 BC, Antigonus fell at Ipsus, slain in battle against the coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. The map redrew itself yet again, and Asia Minor splintered into uneasy kingdoms. While others fought for pieces of Alexander's ghost, Mithridates the founder ruled in silence. Tribute went to the Seleucids when it had to. Fortresses rose in secret when it did not. His agents listened more than they spoke. By the time the dust of Ipsus settled, Pontus had survived without ever joining the war. That patience would become its signature. In the decades that followed, Amasia grew into something greater than a refuge. The tombs of the kings were carved deeper into the rock face, a permanent reminder that even in death, the dynasty would overlook its people. The surrounding valleys filled with villages and shrines. The temple of Ma, goddess of war and fertility, became a pilgrimage site, while the sanctuary of Men, the moon god, drew worshippers from every corner of the Black Sea. These temples were more than places of faith. They were banks, treasuries, and symbols of royal protection. To pray in Pontus was to acknowledge its king. Beyond religion came economy. Pontic steel, forged in the fires of the Chalybes, was prized for its strength. Timber from its forests built the hulls of Rhodian ships. Alum from its mines supplied the textile mills of Ionia. Traders who once bypassed the northern coast now sought Pontic harbors, where the taxes were low and the roads safe. Amasia's scribes began recording customs dues, their ledgers the quiet proof of a growing power. Word spread across the Aegean that a new kingdom had risen, small but stable, a rare thing in an age of broken promises. Mithridates reigned for nearly 40 years. His genius was not in war, but in endurance. He had seen the empires of Alexander's successors bloom and wither. He chose instead to root himself in the land. His palace overlooked the river gorge, a symbol of vigilance rather than luxury. When he died, his sons inherited more than a throne. They inherited a method. Rule lightly, promise much, strike rarely, outlast everyone. Ariobarzanes followed, maintaining the balance his father had created. He married into Cappadocian nobility, fortified the trade routes, and kept his army close to home. When he died, Mithridates II took the throne. By then, the Mithridatid dynasty had begun to seem inevitable, as though the mountains themselves guarded its bloodline. Mithridates II expanded Pontic influence westward through diplomacy, using gifts and marriages where others used armies. His rule was careful, almost invisible, but behind that discretion lay design. Pontus was becoming a hinge between worlds. Greek settlers brought philosophy and sculpture to Amasia. Persian priests preserved their rites beside them. The court hosted poets from Rhodes and astrologers from Babylon. Official decrees appeared in both Greek and Aramaic, the languages of commerce and empire standing side by side. In the countryside, farmers offered the first grain to both Demeter and Anahita, uncertain which goddess listened more kindly. The kingdom no longer asked the question, it had learned to be both. This quiet prosperity transformed Pontus into something new, a power defined not by its size, but by its endurance. While the Seleucid Empire weakened under its own weight, Pontus strengthened in shadow. While Pergamon and Bithynia competed for Rome's attention, Pontus perfected the art of invisibility. Few maps marked its borders clearly, and that vagueness was deliberate. As long as no one quite knew where Pontus began, no one could say for certain where it ended. Far to the west, the Republic of Rome was still locked in wars against Carthage. Its eyes were fixed on Sicily and Spain, not on the Anatolian frontier. Yet its victories sent ripples across the world. Roman merchants began appearing in Aegean harbors. Roman coins reached Pergamon and Rhodes. Every triumph in the west edged its shadow eastward, though no one in Amasia could yet imagine the scale of what was coming. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the Mithridatid dynasty had secured its line. Amasia ruled the mountains. Sinope commanded the sea. The ports filled with ships from all directions. Greek traders, Cappadocian envoys, even cautious emissaries from the Seleucid satraps. The kingdom's strength was quiet, but unmistakable. Travelers crossing its passes spoke of well-paved roads, disciplined guards, and markets that stayed open after sunset. Pontus was no longer a frontier. It was a sanctuary between empires. The founder's dream had endured beyond him. From a flight into obscurity had come a dynasty. From isolation, a bridge between civilizations. The storms of the Black Sea still battered its cliffs, and the mountains still hid their silver. But within those natural walls, something deliberate had taken root. A kingdom born of two worlds, Persian in ancestry and Greek in aspiration. It waited, patient as stone, for the moment when endurance would no longer be enough and ambition would demand its due. By the 3rd century BC, Pontus had outlived the storms that birthed it. What began as a refuge in the mountains had become a functioning realm. Small, yes, but stubbornly complete. The founder was gone, but his lesson endured. Survival was a craft, and patience could be sharper than a sword. His descendants learned it by heart. They ruled not from the momentum of conquest, but from the quiet discipline of permanence. Yet permanence breeds confidence, and confidence, in time, begins to look toward expansion. It was Ariobarzanes, the second of the line, who first turned endurance into policy. He inherited a kingdom hemmed by mountains and stronger neighbors, yet he governed as though borders were negotiable things. His rule was cautious in appearance, ambitious in intent. Envoys crossed the Halys to Cappadocia and Bithynia, bearing gifts, marriage proposals, and the suggestion, never spoken, always understood, that Pontus could be useful. Where armies failed, lineage succeeded. A princess's dowry could achieve what soldiers could not: legitimacy. The king's seal began appearing on treaties and merchant contracts far beyond Amasia. Traders from Rhodes and Miletus brought news of Pontic markets filled with goods once thought provincial. Steel from the forges of the Chalybes, wool from the Phaneroian plateau, silver from the Pariadres mines, timber for shipbuilding, alum for dyeing, iron for weapons, the foundations of a quiet prosperity. The Black Sea, once a barrier, had become Pontus's true frontier. Across its waters lay Greek colonies, Scythian tribes, and the promise of trade routes that could rival any in the east. Under Ariobarzanes, the kingdom began to look outward. Greek cities like Sinop and Amisos gained influence within the royal court, their merchants acting as both financiers and informants. To their eyes, Pontus was a strange hybrid, a monarchy with Persian ceremony and Greek pragmatism. To the Persians of the interior, it was a miracle that their traditions had survived the flood of Hellenism. Somehow both were right. Ariobarzanes governed through duality, his decrees balancing old customs and new ambition, like weights on a scale. When Ariobarzanes died, his son Mithridates II took the throne and gave the dynasty something it had not yet dared to claim: presence. He understood that to survive among empires, a small kingdom needed visibility. His coinage announced that intent, gold status showing the king's profile facing that of Alexander the Great. It was audacious and deliberate. Pontus was not merely surviving in the ruins of Alexander's dream, it was inheriting it. Mithridates II strengthened the administrative heart of his kingdom. Persian satraps governed rural districts, while Greek strategoi managed cities and ports. Taxes were collected in both coin and kind, grain, metal, and horses. Records were kept in Greek for merchants and in Aramaic for priests. Law courts blended Achaemenid discipline with Hellenic rhetoric. This fusion was not compromise. It was invention. Pontus was teaching itself how to govern as both East and West at once. Trade continued to thicken the kingdom's veins. Caravans moved along the Iris River toward the sea, carrying silver and iron to the ports. In return came olive oil, glass, and wine from the Aegean. The roads were safer than anywhere else in Anatolia, guarded by small garrisons stationed at mountain passes. The harbour of Sinope flourished into a regional power, a Greek city under Pontic protection, wealthy enough to mint its own coins, but wise enough to honour the king who guaranteed its security. In every transaction, the influence of Pontus grew a little further from its borders. Diplomacy remained its armour. To the Seleucids, the kings of Pontus paid homage when convenient. To Pergamon, they extended cautious friendship. To Bithynia, they offered uneasy cooperation. Every gesture concealed calculation. The Mithridatid court understood that the fate of Asia Minor depended on choosing the right side at the right time, and never choosing it too early. They watched as the Seleucid Empire began to crack under its own weight, as rival claimants rose and fell in endless succession. Each collapse opened space for Pontus to breathe. Mithridates II died without catastrophe, which for a Hellenistic monarch was itself a triumph. His son, Pharnaces I, inherited a realm stable enough to test its limits. He would be the first of the line to act not as survivor, but as contender. Around 183 BC, Pharnaces led his armies against Sinope, the wealthiest Greek city on the Black Sea. It was a calculated risk. The same city that had long been Pontus's commercial heart was now too powerful, too independent. After a brief campaign, Sinope fell. Its harbour became the kingdom's new gateway to the world, and with its fall, Pontus ceased to be a minor power. The conquest of Sinope marked a turning point. No longer hidden in the mountains, Pontus had announced itself to the Aegean. The city's shipyards expanded under royal supervision, warehouses filled with grain, metals, and timber. The mint began issuing gold coins stamped with the image of a king, wearing the diadem of Alexander. In foreign courts, ambassadors from Pontus were treated as peers of Pergamon and Cappadocia. For the first time, the kingdom's name carried weight beyond its borders. Pharnaces extended Pontic control along the coast from Heraclea to Trapezus, linking the harbours into a chain of wealth and defence. Inland, his governors oversaw mining operations and collected taxes for the royal treasury. The valleys of the Iris and Lycus were cultivated for grain and vineyards. Mountain pastures bred the hardy horses prized by Hellenistic armies. Every province contributed to the growing machine. When Pharnaces entered a city, he did so with both Persian ceremony and Greek rhetoric. A monarch who could pray in two languages and be understood by both gods. Pontus was no longer a backwater, but a crossroads. Greek scholars travelled to Sinope. Anatolian priests brought relics to Amasia. Merchants from the Caucasus arrived with amber and slaves. In the temples of Ma and Men, Greek statues stood beside Persian fire altars. The kingdom's identity was not blended. It was layered, each faith, each custom preserved like stone strata beneath a single crown. Its strength, however, invited new attention. To the west, Pergamon watched uneasily. To the south, the Seleucids sought tribute. And far beyond, the Republic of Rome was beginning to cast its long, acquisitive gaze eastward. Rome's victories over Carthage had made it master of the Mediterranean. Its agents and allies were already spreading through Asia Minor, weaving the web of influence that would one day bind the entire region. For the moment, Pontus remained outside that web, but not unnoticed. The later kings of this era sensed what was coming. They fortified the coastal cities, reinforced the roads to Cappadocia, and ensured that every fortress could outlast a siege. They stocked the treasury with silver and kept the army in constant training. The Mithridatid court became a school of intrigue. where ambassadors dined beside spies and scholars, and the talk was always of Rome. Its power was distant but inevitable, a tide that would eventually reach even the Black Sea. Even so, in those same decades, Pontus reached the height of its early glory. The royal processions through Sinope gleamed with gold and purple. Festivals honored both Greek and Persian gods. The ports were filled with ships bearing the king's seal. From the mountains of Armenia to the harbors of the Aegean, merchants spoke of the Pontic kings as arbiters of trade and patrons of scholars. The dynasty that had begun as fugitives had become architects of stability. Its realm now stretched from the river Halys to the eastern valleys of Colchis, a network of loyalty and profit that held even the restless tribes in check. Through it all, the Mithridatid name carried the weight of continuity. Each ruler swore to protect what the founder had built, independence bought with patience, wealth secured through discipline. Yet beneath the serenity of the court, ambition was stirring. The younger princes studied maps of Anatolia and traced their fingers westward, toward lands that had once belonged to Alexander and were now divided among lesser men. They dreamed not of refuge, but of empire. By the dawn of the 2nd century BC, the world around Pontus was shifting again. The Seleucid kings were fading, Pergamon was aging, Rome was rising. In a measure, the royal scribes began to speak less of survival and more of destiny. The mountains that had once hidden the kingdom now seemed to press outward, impatient with the confines of peace. A century of patience had forged a lineage strong enough to challenge history itself. Somewhere in that line of kings, a child was born who would one day test the limits of endurance and transform patience into defiance. The age of refuge was ending. The age of Mithridates the Great was about to begin. The empires that surrounded Pontus were growing tired. The Seleucids, once heirs to Alexander's lightning, now ruled from distant palaces where intrigue mattered more than conquest. Pergamon, rich and learned, spent its strength on monuments. To the north, the Scythians drifted along the steppe, raiding and retreating like weather. In that quiet between collapsing giants, Pontus found its balance. It had no need to announce itself. The world was doing that for it. When Mithridates V, later called Euergetes, the benefactor, came to power around 150 BC, the kingdom was both old and new. A century of careful rule had given it wealth and stability. A century of foreign wars had thinned its rivals. He inherited a realm with deep roots and unspent ambition. Where his ancestors had hidden behind diplomacy, he saw the opportunity to use it as a weapon. Mithridates, Euergetes, began his reign with generosity, the most dangerous virtue in politics. He sent ships and supplies to aid Rome in the Third Punic War, aligning Pontus with a power whose strength seemed as boundless as the sea. To the world, it looked like loyalty. To Mithridates, it was calculation. The Seleucids were faltering, the Ptolemies decaying, and Rome was too far away to demand obedience. Between them lay a corridor of opportunity, and Pontus stood directly within it. In the courts of Amasya, foreign ambassadors were received amid the echo of marble halls and the scent of burning myrrh. The Pontic king wore the diadem of Alexander, but kept the fire altars of Persia burning in the palace courtyard. His officials wrote in Greek and swore oaths in the name of Ahura Mazda. It was not contradiction, it was strategy. Pontus spoke to every neighbor in the language they most wanted to hear. During his reign, the kingdom expanded its web of alliances. Cappadocia was drawn closer through royal marriage. Lesser Armenia accepted Pontic support, and along the northern shore, the Greek cities found themselves under subtle but constant influence. Every harbour that took Pontic coin became, in time, Pontic in allegiance. Trade and faith were his instruments. Pilgrims came to Comana to offer sacrifices to Ma, the war goddess of the kingdom, her temples heavy with gold and tribute. The priests served both state and crown, their rituals feeding the treasury as much as the spirit. Pontus had become a study in quiet strength. It fielded armies, small but disciplined, trained by veterans from the east. Its fleet patrolled the Euxine, escorting merchant ships carrying timber, silver, and iron. Wealth flowed inward from every shore of the Black Sea. To travelers, it seemed that the gods had woven the mountains themselves into fortifications. A kingdom that had once survived by discretion now thrived through design. Beyond its borders, the Seleucid Empire was unraveling. Governors rebelled, generals betrayed, cities changed masters in the span of a season. Mithridates, Euergetes learned to navigate this chaos as a sailor reads shifting tides. He offered aid to the victors, condolences to the defeated, and tribute to neither. Pontus remained officially loyal to the Seleucid throne, but its loyalty was a phantom, visible, untouchable, and entirely self-serving. As the great empires stumbled, the Mithridatid court turned inward, refining its sense of identity. Philosophers and historians were invited from Athens and Rhodes. Persian magi kept their own schools beside them. The king's children were taught to speak 20 tongues, to read cuneiform as well as Homer, to offer sacrifice with both Greek precision and Persian reverence. Theirs was an education in plurality, a royal experiment in the coexistence of worlds. Even in religion, Pontus was deliberate. The cult of the king had begun to take form, not as blasphemy, but as statecraft. In the temples of Comana, the priests prayed for the king's health with the same devotion once reserved for divine fire. His image appeared beside the gods on coinage. His name was invoked in oaths. The boundary between mortal and divine blurred just enough to remind his subjects that loyalty was sacred. To honor Mithridates was to honor Pontus itself. Yet power, even in its quietest form, breeds enemies. In 121 BC, Mithridates Euergetes was assassinated during a banquet in Sinope, poisoned perhaps by those who thought the kingdom too independent for Rome's liking. His sudden death left the court divided and his heirs young. The nobles whispered, and the air of confidence turned briefly to fear. The line that had survived for generations was now held by a boy barely old enough to understand what crown he wore. The boy's name was Mithridates the Sixth. In time, the world would remember him as Eupator Dionysus, or more simply, the Great. But for now, he was a child in a court of daggers. His mother, Laodice the Sixth, served as regent, ruling in her own name and favoring a younger son. The kingdom that had mastered patience suddenly trembled on the edge of its own ambition. Advisors schemed, generals chose sides. Pontus had learned to play the game of empires, and now it would play the same game against itself. Still, even in crisis, the kingdom remained intact. The systems built by generations, its treasuries, its network of alliances, its belief in the sanctity of the royal line, held firm. The Seleucids, once its overlords, were now too weak to interfere. Rome was still distracted by its own conquests. The mountains and the sea guarded Pontus as they always had. Its people had learned the rhythm of caution, never to rise too quickly, never to fall too far. In those uneasy years, the kingdom's identity deepened rather than dissolved. To the Greek colonies, Pontus was a patron of stability. To the tribes of the interior, it was a symbol of endurance. Its economy thrived even in uncertainty. Mines in the Pariadres range continued to pour silver into the royal coffers. The ports of Sinope and Amisos grew crowded with ships flying the Pontic star. The merchants spoke of fortune, but they also spoke of omens, signs that the kingdom was destined for greater things. In Amasia, the royal tombs looked down upon the river as they had for centuries, their stone faces unchanging. To travelers, the city seemed eternal, untouched by the world's disorder. Yet inside the palace walls, the future of Pontus was being decided by whispers in torchlight. The young Mithridates, sensing danger, would soon flee that palace. Before long, his name would echo across empires. But that story still waited beyond the horizon. For now, Pontus stood between worlds, east and west, caution and power, loyalty and rebellion. The Seleucids, whose shadow had once defined it, were fading from the map. In their place, a new balance was forming, one that would force every small kingdom to choose a side. The era of silent endurance was closing. The world was preparing for noise. In the winter of 135 BC, a comet passed over the mountains of Pontus. The priests of Amasia recorded it as an omen of renewal. Others called it a warning. Not long after, a prince was born beneath that streak of fire, a child whose name would one day fill the maps of the ancient world. He was Mithridates the Sixth, heir to a kingdom that had learned patience for generations and was now about to unlearn it. His father, known to history as the benefactor, left him a throne gilded with danger. The kingdom was rich and secure, but its alliances were delicate, its nobility restless, and its queen ambitious. When the benefactor was murdered, poisoned, some said, by hands close to home, the court fell silent in fear. The widowed queen, Laodice, claimed the regency. Her rule was elegant, her loyalty uncertain. The young prince became a symbol more than a son, an heir in name, but not in power. In those early years, the palace was both cradle and trap. Poison was poured as easily as wine. Whispers moved faster than messages. The boy learned quickly that affection could be lethal. Tutors schooled him in the tongues of empire, Greek, Persian, Phrygian, Aramaic. But his truest lessons came from survival. By the time he was a teenager, the stories say, he could read 20 languages and speak nearly as many. The child of two worlds had made both his own. When he reached his 15th year, a dream, or perhaps an instinct, saved his life. Warned that his mother planned to end his claim, he fled into the wilderness with a handful of loyal guards. For 7 years, he disappeared into the mountains. No historian agrees on what he did there, only that he returned changed. Some say he lived among nomads and hunters, learning to fight and to ride. Others that he studied poisons, testing them on himself until he built an immunity to death. The legend of the Poison King begins there, somewhere between necessity and myth. Far from court, he became a creature of endurance. The mountains taught him hunger and patience. The forests taught silence. When he returned to Amasia around 113 BC, he was no longer a boy, but a man molded by suspicion. He walked into his mother's palace like a stranger. Within a year, she was dead. Some said by poison, others by the same will she had once tried to extinguish. The prince took the diadem, his expression unreadable. The courtiers began to call him Eupator Dionysus, the one born of a god, and for once, the title did not sound exaggerated. From the moment of his coronation, Pontus began to change its pulse. The young ruler reorganized the court, dismissing sycophants and replacing them with men who had proved themselves in hardship. Among them was Dorylaeus, a soldier scholar who would later command his armies, and Metrodorus of Skepsis, a philosopher so skilled in rhetoric that the Romans nicknamed him the Greek who hated Rome. Around them gathered exiles, adventurers, and mercenaries, a court of survivors bound not by birth, but by ambition. The new monarch ruled like a man always listening for footsteps behind him. He rose before dawn to read reports from every fortress. He inspected the army in person, riding alongside common soldiers. He oversaw experiments in medicine and poison, with the same fascination others reserved for astronomy. His servants whispered that he tested every meal, every goblet, every ally. Yet beneath that caution burned vision. He spoke of empire, not the kind ruled from marble palaces, but one bound by sea and steel. Pontus, under his hand, began to expand. The coast of the Black Sea, long dominated by Greek colonies, was drawn under his protection. He sent envoys to the Bosporan kingdom in the Crimea, proposing alliance through marriage and trade. The northern tribes who had once raided Pontic ships were now paid in coin and promise. To the east, he struck into Colchis, securing the mountain passes of the Caucasus. To the west, he courted Cappadocia and Bithynia with diplomacy that hid a blade behind every smile. The small kingdom of his ancestors was turning into a maritime empire. Even as he conquered, he cultivated. Temples were rebuilt, ports dredged, new roads cut through the mountains. Scholars were invited from Athens and Babylon. Physicians from Alexandria studied under his patronage. The court spoke Greek in the morning and Persian at night. The monarch himself presided over debates on philosophy, science, and strategy, his voice calm, his eyes always measuring. Those who met him described him as tall, broad-shouldered, fluent in all things, and frighteningly self-contained. Power seemed to radiate from him, steady and cold. The people adored him. In every city, from Amasia to Sinop, statues rose depicting him as a new Alexander, a man of destiny chosen to unite East and West. He encouraged the image. On his coinage, he appeared in the style of both conqueror and sage. Behind his head, the star of Pontus gleamed above the diadem. The coins carried his likeness across the Black Sea, spreading a message as deliberate as any army. The age of refuge was over. In the valleys and along the harbors, that message took root. Farmers harvested under banners bearing the royal star. Priests in Comana prayed to the goddess Ma for the king's victory. The fleet grew until Pontic sails outnumbered all others on the Euxine. Caravans brought goods from Armenia, Scythia, and the Bosporan ports. Pontic merchants began appearing in markets as far away as Delos and Rhodes. The kingdom that had once survived by being invisible now commanded attention. Still, the new ruler's ambition had boundaries, at least for the moment. He knew Rome's appetite, and he studied its habits like a physician studying a fever. For every alliance he made, he imagined how the Republic might turn it against him. He read their generals' campaigns, memorized their laws, even learned to speak Latin, though he despised the sound of it. To fight an enemy, he said once, you must first understand his logic. The remark was written down by a scribe, then erased by another, who feared it might one day be used as evidence. What Rome saw as a distant client state was, in truth, an empire forming behind the Black Sea's veil. Pontus had become a network of loyalty, stretching from Armenia to the Crimean steppe. Its soldiers were trained in both phalanx and cavalry warfare. Its fleet patrolled every horizon. Its ruler slept little, ate less, and trusted no one. Yet he also dreamed, not of defense, but of destiny. He believed himself chosen to restore balance to a world that had forgotten its center. In the palace of Amasia, the fires burned late into the night. The king studied maps illuminated by oil lamps. his shadow stretching across the marble floor. Beyond those walls, the rivers ran toward the sea, carrying news of victories and treaties, of new ships and new alliances. Somewhere in those waters, history was gathering momentum. The tiger had awakened, and soon the world would learn how long he had been waiting. By the dawn of the 1st century BC, Pontus was no longer content to survive. 100 years of caution had taught its kings how to wait. Now a single mind was teaching them how to move. From the mountain citadel of Amasia to the harbors of Sinop, the will of one man reshaped the sea. The ruler who had once fled from his own mother now ruled half the coast of the Black Sea. The world called him Mithridates the Great, though within Pontus, his subjects spoke of him as simply the king. He had turned fear into discipline, exile into empire. Where his ancestors hid behind geography, he saw geography as destiny. Shipyards rose like forests along the Pontic coast. At Sinope, hammers rang day and night, timber bending to design rather than accident. From the iron mines of the Chalybes came nails and blades. From the valleys of Phaneroia came grain to feed the builders. By the time the last hull slid into the water, more than 400 warships bore the star of Pontus on their sails. The Euxine, once shared by Greek merchants and Scythian raiders, had become a Pontic dominion. Across those waters, the king extended his reach without yet drawing a sword. In Colchis, he offered alliance and protection, binding local nobles to his line by marriage and gold. In the Bosporan kingdom, far to the north, he placed his own governors and sealed the bond with family blood. Grain from the Crimean plains now sailed south under Pontic banners, feeding both soldiers and cities. The harbors that had once feared Pontic ships now depended on them. Trade and empire moved together, each disguised as the other. Even the remotest provinces felt the rhythm of expansion. Paphlagonia, Galatia, and Lesser Armenia fell under Pontic influence, governed by officials who reported directly to Sinope. Roads crossed the mountains, milestones carved with inscriptions in both Greek and Aramaic. At their ends stood new fortresses, where the banners of Pontus snapped against the wind. What had been a patchwork of tribes and colonies was becoming a single body, its arteries the roads, its heartbeat the sea. The king himself was everywhere and nowhere. He inspected shipyards in disguise, rode with his cavalry through the mountain passes, and appeared unannounced in the temples of Comana. He could debate a philosopher in Greek before breakfast and command a regiment in Persian by noon. His court mirrored his nature, half intellect, half threat. Scholars argued beside generals. Physicians tested antidotes while engineers drafted siege towers. Every discipline, every curiosity served the same unspoken purpose: preparation. Pontus had begun to dream beyond the limits of its geography. The monarch's fleet secured the Black Sea. His armies secured the passes to Armenia and Cappadocia. Diplomats spoke of friendship with Rome, yet his spies counted Roman garrisons along the Aegean. He studied the Republic's methods the way a physician studies a contagion, identifying symptoms, measuring its spread, searching for its weakness. To those who asked what he sought, he answered only, "Freedom does not wait for permission." In Sinope, he built a palace to rival those of Alexandria and Antioch. Mosaic floors depicted Alexander crowned by Nike. Above the throne, a golden sunburst echoed the royal emblem of Pontus. During festivals, he appeared before the crowd draped in purple, carrying a torch as the priests hailed him as favored of Mar, the war goddess of the land. To his people, he was protector and reformer. To his enemies, a man too brilliant to remain still. Coins bearing his image circulated from the Caucasus to Crete, each one a fragment of propaganda, each one a promise that Pontus had entered history's center stage. His rule blended cruelty and generosity with unsettling ease. Cities that submitted were rewarded with tax relief. Those that resisted were rebuilt under Pontic law. He funded schools, theatres, and harbours, but never forgot to build arsenals beside them. He spoke of civilization while counting arrows. Even his fascination with poisons, now the stuff of legend, was part of the same philosophy: mastery of all things, even death. To his allies, he seemed the ideal monarch, educated, disciplined, unyielding. To Rome, he was a problem waiting to happen. The Republic's agents in Asia watched his rise with the wary respect of hunters tracking a predator they could neither trap nor ignore. Reports reached the Senate describing Pontus as rich in metals, grain, and soldiers, its ruler fluent in 20 tongues and immune to every toxin. It was said that even his patience was dangerous. Beyond the seas, the map of power was shifting again. The Seleucids were fading into memory. The Armenian king Tigranes the Great had become both ally and son-in-law. Cappadocia hovered between dependency and annexation. The only check on Pontic ambition was Bithynia, a minor kingdom surviving on Roman approval. Its weakness tempted him. When he looked west, he no longer saw neighbors. He saw inheritance. Still, he held his armies in restraint. The wars of others had taught him that empire gained too quickly collapses under its own weight. So he expanded in circles, layer by layer, until even patience became a strategy of conquest. He let merchants and scholars carry his influence farther than his soldiers. By the time his fleet reached the Hellespont, his flag was already familiar in every harbour. Pontus had become the language of prosperity. And yet, behind that calm surface, Rome's presence grew harder to ignore. Its senators carved new provinces from the remains of Pergamon, and its governors behaved like kings. Wherever Roman merchants traded, Roman soldiers followed. The Republic's power advanced not with armies, but with contracts, debts, and alliances that bound as tightly as chains. In Pergamon, Roman coin replaced local currency. In Cappadocia, Roman agents chose the heirs of princes. Every concession bought a little peace and sold a little freedom. From Amasia, the monarch read these reports in silence. He did not rage, he prepared. New fortresses rose along the Halys River. The fleet doubled again. Envoys traveled east to Parthia, exploring what alliance might be made against the West. He was patient, but no longer passive. The Black Sea had been mastered. Now his gaze turned toward Anatolia itself. Scholars later argued that he wanted only security, that Rome forced him into war. Perhaps, but security for Mithridates meant dominance, and dominance meant empire. He spoke less of independence now, more of destiny. In the council chamber, he would stand over the maps of Asia Minor, tracing coastlines with his finger, as if memory alone could redraw them. "We were born in the shadow of empires," he once said. "It is time to cast one." The sea carried those words farther than he intended. Sailors repeated them in Delos and Rhodes. Merchants whispered them in the markets of Pergamon. To the Greeks groaning under Roman taxes, they sounded like prophecy. To Roman governors, like defiance. Pontus had become a mirror, reflecting every hope and every fear of the age. Still, within the walls of his palace, the king remained composed. He still dined with philosophers, still debated medicine and astronomy, still tested antidotes on prisoners whose names no one recorded. He could be generous, charming, even kind, but always with calculation. The courtiers learned to measure their words, for beneath the civility of his court lay something restless, waiting for provocation. That provocation was already forming beyond his borders. In Bithynia, a reckless monarch, propped up by Roman gold, was beginning to test the patience of his powerful neighbor. Raids across the frontier multiplied. Merchants complained of harassment. Rome, predictably, looked the other way. The pattern was ancient: provoke, then intervene, then rule. The king of Pontus recognized the design at once. One evening, standing on the cliffs above Sinope, he watched the sun drop into the sea. Below him, the harbor glittered with hundreds of anchored ships, their masts black against the fire of the sky. He said nothing, but those beside him remembered the look on his face, a mixture of calm and inevitability. For years he had built, studied, and waited. Now the waiting was nearly done. The dream of empire had taken shape. Pontus controlled 6 provinces, commanded the greatest navy east of Italy, and ruled a people convinced they were destined for more. Only one power remained between the monarch and the realization of his design. That power was Rome, and it had just begun to notice him. For years, the harbors of Pontus had seemed to sleep beneath their own reflection. Ships rocked in the tide, their sails furled. The sea glittered with the quiet confidence of mastery. Yet peace, in kingdoms like this, was never still for long. It was a surface phenomenon, like calm water hiding the pressure of a rising storm. The ruler who had forged this quiet knew it better than anyone. Mithridates the Great had turned the Black Sea into a fortress and the mountains of Anatolia into his treasury. But victory, once achieved, demanded to be defended. Each harbor conquered had to be fed, each alliance maintained. And in the west, beyond the Hellespont, a republic of wolves had begun to smell the wealth on the wind. Rome's presence in Asia was subtle but suffocating. It had no legions stationed along the Pontic frontier, no armies in open challenge. Instead, it sent men with ledgers and smiles, governors of the new province of Asia, once the proud kingdom of Pergamon, arrived with orders written in Latin and an appetite written in greed. Tax collectors, the publicani, drained the Greek cities at 20% interest, demanding gold for a peace they themselves disturbed. Behind them came envoys promising protection. Pontus understood what that word meant. At first, the king responded as he always had, with patience disguised as courtesy. His ambassadors greeted Roman envoys in perfect Latin. His letters spoke of alliance, and his gifts were generous. But beneath the diplomacy, he began to prepare. Fortresses along the Halys River were reinforced, and arsenals in Sinope filled with spears and bolts. The fleet, already unmatched, was doubled again. Rome dealt in pretexts. He would deny them one. The first challenge came not from Rome itself, but from Bithynia, Pontus's neighbor and long-time irritant. Nicomedes IV, a minor king with major debts, ruled there at Rome's pleasure. His treasury was empty, his throne precarious, and his advisors, most of them Roman bankers, urged him to raid the north. He obeyed. Under the guise of border disputes, Bithynian troops crossed into Pontic lands, burning fields and plundering caravans. Their arrogance rested on the belief that Rome would protect them from reprisal. In Amasia, the reports arrived by the dozen. Villages razed, farmers slain, border patrols overwhelmed. The monarch read each one in silence. At last, he turned to his generals. "They mistake restraint for weakness," he said. "Let us correct their understanding." Orders went out the next morning. 2 armies marched west, commanded by Archelaus and Neoptolemus, veterans of the Bosporan campaigns. Their discipline was absolute, their strategy deceptive. They drew the Bithynians deep into the valleys near the river Amnias, then fell upon them in converging wings. The slaughter was swift and methodical. Only a fraction of the invaders escaped. For those who did, the story became legend. The chariots with blades on their axles, the infantry advancing like a single creature, and the banner of the Pontic star rising through the smoke. The victory sent shockwaves through Anatolia. For the first time in living memory, a local power had defied a Roman client and won. In the cities of the Aegean, Greek merchants whispered of freedom. In temples, priests prayed for the king of Pontus as savior of the East. Even the most cautious began to dream of what might follow if someone truly dared to challenge the Republic. The name of Mithridates spread like rumor turned into faith. Rome's agents did not remain idle. Manius Aquilius, governor of Asia, and a man whose greed was as famous as his insignificance, decided to make an example of the rebel monarch. He gathered a force of mercenaries, Bithynian survivors, and local auxiliaries, and marched east under the pretense of restoring order. Order was the last thing he brought. His soldiers pillaged the cities they passed, demanding payment for a war that had not yet begun. When his demands reached Amasia, surrender, tribute, and the dismissal of Pontic armies, the reply was silence. Aquilius took that silence for fear. It was his final mistake. The king's response came not in letters, but in movement. His generals struck at Protopacium, where Aquilius had encamped his hybrid army. The engagement was brief, brutal, and decisive. Pontic cavalry cut through Roman lines before sunrise. Scythed chariots shattered their center, and by nightfall the plain was littered with the dead. Aquilius was captured attempting to flee. Legend claims he was executed by molten gold poured down his throat, a fitting tribute to his avarice, though historians have never proved it. The story mattered more than the truth. Across Asia Minor, the tale became gospel. Rome's greed had met its punishment. The aftermath was unlike anything the region had seen since Alexander's campaigns. Bithynia collapsed. Cappadocia submitted. From the Halys to the Aegean, cities opened their gates. The king moved west, not as conqueror, but as liberator. In Sardis, he proclaimed freedom from debt. In Ephesus, he forgave taxes for 5 years. Everywhere he went, statues of Roman officials were toppled, their names struck from inscriptions. His proclamations were written in Greek and spoke of brotherhood, not dominion. The East shall no longer serve the West, they declared. It was politics, but also poetry, and poetry moves faster than armies. Rome was caught unprepared. Its Senate, distracted by the social war raging in Italy, could not respond. The Republic's legions were pinned at home, its generals consumed by civil conflict. In the vacuum, Pontus became the law of the land. By 88 BC, Mithridates ruled more of Asia Minor than any monarch since Alexander. His fleet patrolled the Aegean, his agents negotiated in Athens, his treasuries overflowed with Roman spoils. The world that had once ignored him now revolved around his name. But success carries its own poison. Among his advisors, voices rose urging him to finish what he had begun, to drive Rome from the east entirely. Others counseled restraint, warning that the Republic's fury, once stirred, would be endless. The king listened to all and trusted none. He had spent a lifetime building defenses against betrayal. Now he found he needed them against ambition. One night, in the palace at Sardis, he gathered his commanders. Maps lay spread before them. Greece, Asia, the Mediterranean, all glowing in the light of oil lamps. Rome is not a city, he said. It is a hunger. You cannot reason with hunger. You feed it, or you destroy it. None answered. Outside, the streets were alive with celebration, but inside the room, the air felt heavy, as though history itself were holding its breath. Over the next months, Pontic influence reached even farther. Greek islands aligned themselves with the king. Local rulers swore allegiance. To his supporters, it looked like divine justice. To Rome, it was revolt. The Senate could no longer ignore what was happening. A name that had once appeared on diplomatic scrolls now appeared in declarations of war. And so, the stage was set. The world's greatest republic and its most dangerous monarch stood at the edge of collision. Between them lay Asia, rich, weary, waiting to be claimed again. What began as border raids had become a confrontation of civilizations. The discipline of the Republic against the defiance of a king who believed himself chosen by fate. The sparks that had flickered for years now touched powder. Somewhere near the coast, the first Roman ships were already being prepared. The sails would bear the red of vengeance. In the silence before they launched, the people of Pontus looked to the horizon and saw the faint glow of dawn. It was beautiful, and it was the color of fire. When the orders were given, they traveled faster than ships. Messengers on horseback carried them through the provinces, sealed with the royal emblem and the promise of obedience. Each letter was brief, just a handful of sentences written in the calm language of administration. The meaning, however, was merciless. At dawn, on a spring morning in 88 BC, across the cities of Asia Minor, the world changed in a single breath. In Ephesus, Pergamon, Adramyttium, and Tralles, Roman citizens awoke to knocks at their doors. Some were summoned to temples, others to public squares. They came unarmed, trusting the law that had once protected them. By midday, that law was ash. The slaughter was precise, almost ritual. In Ephesus, they were cut down within the temple of Artemis. In Pergamon, their bodies filled the marketplace. In Cornus, citizens were drowned in the harbor. Plutarch claimed 80,000 dead. Appian, 150,000. The numbers mattered less than the silence that followed. The Republic's power in the East had vanished in a day. To its victims, it was massacre. To the Greeks who had suffered under Roman debt and taxation, it was justice long deferred. From Amasia, the king of Pontus watched his secret become history. He had unleashed violence with the efficiency of a decree. The act was both vengeance and proclamation. No longer would he speak of peace while Rome encircled him. Across the Aegean, Greek envoys hailed him as liberator. Statues were raised in his honor. Oracles declared that a new Alexander had risen in the east. The illusion was complete. Even the gods, it seemed, had changed allegiance. His armies moved faster than rumor. Archelaus led the fleet into the Aegean, sweeping Roman garrisons from the islands. Athens, weary of Roman governors and their taxes, opened its gates to the Pontic general Aristion, a philosopher-tyrant who proclaimed the rebirth of freedom. The temples of Attica rang with hymns to the Eastern king. From the walls of the Acropolis, his banners fluttered beside those of ancient heroes. For the first time in centuries, Greece imagined itself free. Rome, however, had not forgotten how to respond to blasphemy. Amid civil war and chaos, the Senate turned to a general named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose ambition matched Mithridates' own. Sulla had fought his fellow Romans to claim the command of this war. Now he would fight for vengeance. In the autumn of 87 BC, his legions crossed the Adriatic and landed in Epirus. They marched east through the dust of forgotten battlefields, retracing Alexander's steps in reverse. Where the Macedonian had conquered east for west, Sulla came to reclaim it. Athens met him not with diplomacy, but defiance. Aristian's garrison fortified the city and the port of Piraeus. For months, Sulla's troops besieged them, cutting the olive groves for siege works, melting temple treasures for coin. Hunger hollowed the defenders. On the 1st of March, 86 BC, the Roman legions breached the walls. The slaughter that followed mirrored the massacre that had begun the war. The philosopher-tyrant was dragged from the Acropolis. The city that had once taught Rome philosophy now learned its cruelty. In the north, Archelaus gathered the remnants of the Pontic army. They met Sulla's legions in Boeotia, near the field of Cheronea, where Philip of Macedon had once broken Greek independence. The symmetry was cruelly perfect. Mithridates' soldiers numbered more than 70,000, infantry, cavalry, and the scythed chariots that had terrorized Asia. Sulla commanded barely 40,000. The battle began at dawn, fought through dust and confusion. The Pontic right flank tried to envelop the Romans, but the discipline of the legions held. Chariots charged, wheels shrieking, and were swallowed by the Roman lines. By nightfall, the field belonged to Sulla. 10,000 Pontic troops escaped by sea. The rest became a rumor carried by crows. Defeat did not yet mean disaster. Mithridates still held Asia. His fleet still ruled the Aegean, but his aura of invincibility had cracked. Archelaus retreated to Orchomenus, where he attempted to regroup. Sulla followed, relentless as a tide. The second battle lasted 2 days, fought among marshes and ditches dug by desperate men. When it ended, the Pontic army was gone. Archelaus fled. Sulla stood over another ruined landscape. The gods, it seemed, had changed their minds again. Far away in Sardes, the king received the news without visible anger. He had always expected reversals. History had taught him that victories are loans, not gifts. The Romans fight with numbers, he said, but I fight with time. He withdrew his forces, signed a temporary peace at Dardanus in 85 BC, and prepared to begin again. To his enemies, it looked like submission. To him, survival. The art of Pontus had always been to lose strategically. The terms of peace demanded the return of all conquered territory and a vast indemnity, 3,000 talents of silver. Mithridates paid in full. The gold of Pontus crossed the sea in guarded convoys, a silent river of wealth flowing into Roman coffers. The senators congratulated themselves on restoring order. Yet in the markets of Ephesus and the hills of Cappadocia, people still whispered the king's name as one speaks of a storm that has passed, but left the smell of thunder behind. For Pontus, peace was a pause, not a surrender. Its ports still thrived, its mines still poured silver. The soldiers returned to their garrisons, but their weapons were not melted down. In the temples of Ma and Men, the priests continued to pray for the monarch's health, their hymns unchanged. Even as Sulla sailed home to civil war, Mithridates began to rebuild the fleet and to train new armies. Defeat had taught him nothing he did not already know, that patience and preparation are two sides of conquest. In the end, the First Mithridatic War was less a resolution than an introduction. Rome had learned his name. The world had learned his reach. Between them lay unfinished business. The king of Pontus was still alive, still rich, still defiant, and somewhere in the back rooms of his palace, among the charts and poisons, he was already planning how to turn peace into the next act of war. Silence returned to the harbors first. After the treaties were signed in 85 BC and Sulla sailed west with his indemnity, the Aegean stopped bristling with oars. In Sinope, crews stacked furled sails like folded wings. In Amisos, shipwrights listened to the tide without the clangor of alarm. The war had ended in parchment and coin. It had not ended in hearts. Inside the palaces of Amasya and Sinope, the ruler who had shaken the world refused to behave like a defeated man. Mithridates the Great received petitions, audited treasuries, and heard lawsuits with the old patience, never once allowing the court to speak the word surrender. He had signed peace. He had not sworn to forget. Letters went out quietly to governors and admirals. Store grain, refurbish walls, survey anchorages, pay the craftsmen in advance. The kingdom would live as though tomorrow were ordinary, and prepare as though tomorrow were a siege. Councils turned to the discipline of repair. Dorylaeus, the tactician who had studied Roman methods with professional hatred, persuaded the monarch to reorganize whole divisions. Phalanxes were rearmed and drilled to move in smaller, flexible blocks. Cavalry wings learned to break and reform on command, rather than momentum. Light infantry practiced skirmishing in rough country instead of marching for parades. At arsenals along the Halys, smiths forged new spearheads and peeler imitations, test throwing them at shield frames until the wood split clean. The king listened to every report with narrowed concentration. This was not imitation of Rome, he said. This was domestication of an enemy's virtue. At sea, the work was subtler. Shipyards in Sinope and Amisos were ordered to rebuild without spectacle. One keel laid under cover of darkness. 2 galleys slipped from their cradles at dawn before the markets awoke. Hulls were strengthened for rams. Oar benches refitted so crews could pull longer without bleeding. The old Admiralty charts were recopied and corrected. Every shoal and current measured again, as if the water itself had shifted in defeat. A fleet that looked asleep to Rome would, at a word, rise with its full strength. Meanwhile, the kingdom mended its nerves. Spies and couriers, merchants, scholars, sailors, actors with blameless smiles, knotted the territories into a web. From Cappadocia and Bithynia came news of governors looting cities to appease creditors. From Rhodes, rumors of Roman envoys probing for allies among the islands. From Greece, hard talk about taxes and the arrogance of appointees sent from Italy to rule men who remembered Marathon. Reports arrived coded in inventories, stitched into cloth lists, hidden in the margins of plays. The ruler who trusted little trusted information absolutely. Not all rebuilding was made of iron. In the women's quarters of the court, the private life of the monarch began to shape politics. Monime, a Greek noblewoman famed for a learning that did not ask permission, read philosophy with him in the afternoons and argued sentences with a gravity that steadied the chamber. Later, Hypsicratia, the companion who dressed and rode like a cavalryman, appeared at inspections with hair braided for the saddle and hands blistered by reins. One softened the rooms where decisions were made. The other hardened the roads along which those decisions would be enforced. Their presence told the officers something no proclamation could. The king's household itself had chosen endurance. Rome, true to its nature, could not keep still. Sulla's peace had the clarity of a winter sky, a brightness that promised more weather. In 83, B.C. Lucius Licinius Murena, a governor with a short temper and long ambitions, crossed the Halys with Roman eagles and a theory of opportunity. He claimed the monarch had violated treaty terms. He preferred raids to arguments. Villages burned, fortlets were harried, markets emptied at the rumor of bronze shields on the road. The Republic had not declared war, but men died as though it had. Pontus did not panic. Veterans rallied to their standards. Dorylaeus moved units like an abacus master shifting counters. Skirmishes became lessons, lessons became rehearsals, rehearsals became a campaign. Near the river, old chronicles call it the Halys. Some say another tributary. The Pontic counterstroke fell cleanly on the Roman advance. Murena, who had expected farmers with spears, found a line that bent and did not break, cavalry that refused to chase, reserves that appeared at the exact minute fatigue set in. By winter, the invader had been driven back in such order as he could manage. The Senate, unwilling to spend blood on a policy it had not authorized, sent word, "Stand down." Murena sheathed his sword and slunk away, with dignity none but his own officers believed. The Second Mithridatic War, if such a name belongs to so brief a fury, ended not in triumph but in a proof. Pontus had absorbed Rome's method and survived its test. Soldiers returned to their barracks with a new manner, the confidence of men who had been told they were broken and discovered they were not. In the temples of Ma at Comana and Men at Cabira, the priests offered modest sacrifices in thanksgiving, careful not to tempt the gods with grandeur. Victory too loudly named is an invitation to envy. Across the Black Sea, allies were cultivated with the patience of gardeners. Tigranes the Great in Armenia, son-in-law, partner, equal in a way few men could claim, received envoys wreathed in small courtesies and large promises. Along the Caucasus, nobles who remembered the iron taste of Scythian raids were reminded what Pontic ships had made possible. Grain moved safely. Children were not taken in the night. In the Bosporan harbours, the customs officials stamped documents with a practiced indifference that masked complete loyalty. An empire without a name was being rehearsed. Propaganda, that other engine of states, went to work as assiduously as the shipwrights. Decrees in Greek spoke of Eleutheria, freedom from predatory tax farmers, from judges who sold verdicts, from soldiers whose Latin was louder than their law. Coins carried the calm profile of the sovereign, and behind it the familiar star, a punctum of light repeated until it became instinct. In marketplaces, pamphleteers read aloud histories in which the East had always been the author of balance and the West the inventor of hunger. No one believed every word. Enough believed enough. Daily governance kept the kingdom alive while designs advanced. Harvests were counted, aqueducts repaired, mines regulated to keep silver flowing without killing the men who dug it. The monarch who studied poison insisted that arsenic not be washed into the streams that fed the lower farms, useful knowledge reserved for enemies, not citizens. A state that had learned to win by terror now remembered to rule by competence. Preparations for the future remained cloaked in courtesy. Envoys to Rome carried phrases polished like marble: peace, mutual respect, the sanctity of treaties. None mentioned the dry docks at Sinope, now heavy with new pine, or the cavalry remount program that pulsed like a second heartbeat through the Phaneroian plain. When a senator's cousin passed through Amisos on business, he reported a comforting sight. Markets busy, soldiers polite, no talk of war. He had not seen the warehouses behind the amphorae, or the oarmasters drilling new crews to a metronome tapped against a beam. In private hours, the king rehearsed a different art, the management of fear. He had lived too long with poison to ignore what rumor can do to a court. So he walked the barracks at night and asked sergeants about rations, stopped at farmsteads to examine granaries with his own hands, rewarded a dockhand for pointing out a flaw in a keel. It was not theatre. It was the building of a covenant in which men would follow him, not merely because they were commanded, but because they had seen him look at the same splinter they did and call it by its right name. Not everyone consented to patience. Young nobles, flushed with the memory of early victories, argued for a march west at once. Older officers who had stood in dust at Cheronea and mud at Orchomenus advised the arithmetic of caution. He listened to both and decided without remark. Roads were improved, magazines stocked, and frontier fortresses taught to send smoke signals in a new sequence that could carry a warning 100 miles before a horse could. Waiting in his hands became action. Time itself began to rearrange. In towns loyal to the dynasty, public proclamations dated the year from the accession of their ruler rather than Roman consuls. Small numbers with large implications. Scholars in Sinope copied histories emphasizing Persian and Anatolian lineages, binding Pontus to ages older than the Senate's memory. Even theatre troupes learned new endings. Plays that once closed in reconciliation now ended in ambiguous applause, as though the audience were being asked to decide whose law would prevail. Winter came down from the mountains with its usual severity, and with it a sense that the world had narrowed to essentials: fire, grain, iron, oath. In the dim halls of Amasia, lamps marked out constellations on marble floors, and officials stepped carefully among them with bundles of reports. At a long table, the monarch laid out maps and tokens, garrisons represented by carved ashwood blocks, ships by little wedges of oak, and arranged them not in lines of battle, but in chains of supply. War, he said once to Dorylus, is won by the last cart that arrives on the last usable road in the last hour of daylight. The general nodded and ordered another road paved before spring. A year after Dardanus, the kingdom outwardly resembled any other. Markets full, courts functioning, festivals performed with the proper smoke. Inwardly, it did not resemble the state that had sued for peace. The army was crisper, the fleet more numerous, the treasuries heavier, the mind at the center clearer and colder. Murena's incursion had been a rehearsal the audience mistook for a curtain call. Toward the end of that quiet year, a message arrived from the west, one of those Roman letters that managed to be both polite and insulting. It congratulated Pontus on its adherence to the treaty and requested assurances that Cappadocia would remain free to choose princes acceptable to our allies. The reply, drafted in Greek and translated into Latin with exact civility, promised respect for Cappadocian customs and reminded the sender that alliances thrive where promises are kept. No threat, no plea, just the weight of a sentence that could not be picked up and carried away. So the kingdom waited, a bow unstrung to preserve the wood. On clear nights, Sinop's harbour showed 1,000 small flames where watchmen warmed their hands. By day, the slipways looked almost idle. In Amasia, the tombs of the kings watched the river as they always had, impassive as cliff and time. Yet everyone who mattered knew the stillness was posture. The storm that had passed had taught Pontus how to bend and not break. The next would teach others what bending feels like. When spring finally softened the mountain passes, riders went out along roads that had quietly grown smoother. They carried no manifestos. They carried lists, grain tallies, horse counts, the names of captains whose judgment held when fear rose. Beyond the frontier, Rome's clients argued, bled, and begged for advice no one in Italy had time to give. Between them stood a state that had been pronounced defeated and had taken the diagnosis as motive. Peace had given Pontus exactly what its ruler required: time to reassemble the instrument he meant to play. What remained was to choose the first note. Somewhere to the west, a governor would overreach. A banker would demand too much interest. A client king would raid the wrong valley. The monarch did not have to hasten it. He had learned in exile and in victory alike that fate prefers a door opened at the right hour. The next war would not roar into being. It would arrive the way weather does across the Black Sea, An ordinary horizon, a change in the taste of the wind, a pressure that makes even seasoned sailors glance up. By then the oarsmen would be at their benches, the horses fed, the letters written, the maps worn at the folds. Between storms, Pontus had remembered itself. For nearly a decade after Dardanus, the world pretended that peace was possible. Rome congratulated itself on its victory. Pontus rebuilt as though peace were merely another phase of strategy. Between them lay Cappadocia and Bithynia, buffer states of uneasy loyalty, their kings alternating between gratitude and fear. It was an arrangement that could not last. In 75 BC, the illusion collapsed. Nicomedes, the fourth of Bithynia, dying without heirs, willed his kingdom to Rome, less an act of gratitude than a plea for protection. The Senate accepted, and with a single decree, Roman rule crept to the border of Pontus. No legions had marched, no fortresses fallen, yet the balance that had endured for generations was broken. To Mithridates, it was an act of encirclement disguised as inheritance. The Republic had reached his doorstep and smiled. He answered as he always had, not with declarations, but with motion. Troops advanced under cover of night, crossing into Bithynia before Rome could react. The campaign began like a rehearsal, swift and confident. Cities surrendered without resistance, grateful to trade one master for another. When Roman envoys protested, they were escorted to the frontier and sent home with gifts. By the time the Senate could debate, the invasion was complete. Rome's answer came, as it always did, late, decisive, and overwhelming. A new governor of Asia, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was given command of 5 legions. The man was more scholar than soldier, a statesman with a taste for Greek culture and a will of iron. He studied his enemy before he fought him, reading every report from the previous wars as if the king of Pontus were a riddle to be solved rather than an enemy to be crushed. "We will not chase him," Lucullus told his officers. "We will outlast him." The opening battles favored the king. In 74 BC, his armies overran Bithynia and Cappadocia, driving Roman garrisons into flight. Cities that had endured Roman taxation welcomed him as liberator once again. The Senate declared war, and Lucullus marched east to meet him. The armies collided near the town of Cyzicus on the coast of the Propontis, where the Pontic fleet supported the siege from the sea. For months, Lucullus encircled the besiegers, cutting their supplies, letting winter do what battle could not. When the ice came, starvation followed. Mithridates ordered a retreat. Disease turned it into a rout. Of the army that had crossed into Asia, half never returned. The victory cost Lucullus nothing but patience. Defeat forced adaptation. The king withdrew to the interior, rallying his forces around Cabira, a fortress in the mountains of Pontus. There, in narrow valleys and snow-fed rivers, he rediscovered his genius for defense. He used terrain as weapon, weather as ally. When Lucullus pursued him through the passes, his legions found empty towns, burnt fields, poisoned wells. The campaign stretched into years, 3, then 4, until exhaustion dulled the edge of both sides. Rome had superior numbers. Pontus had endurance. Between them lay a landscape turning to dust. The king's alliances held longer than anyone expected. His son-in-law, Tigranes, the Great of Armenia, offered sanctuary and troops. When Lucullus pressed north, the two monarchs met in secret at Artaxata, the Armenian capital. Their banners, sunburst of Pontus, Lion of Armenia, fluttered together for the last time. Tigranes agreed to join the war, not out of friendship, but necessity. He feared that once Pontus fell, Armenia would be next. It was the logic of survival dressed as loyalty. In 69 BC, the combined Pontic-Armenian army confronted Lucullus at Tigranocerta, the new Armenian capital built by Tigranes to mirror the cities of the Hellenistic world. The scale of the battle dwarfed anything since the days of Alexander. Tigranes commanded more than 100,000 men, archers, cataphracts, and the massive eastern cavalry whose armor gleamed like sunrise. The Roman general had fewer than 20,000. His officers begged him to retreat. Lucullus smiled. "The greater the number, the greater the confusion," he said, and ordered the attack. The Roman legions advanced with methodical precision, breaking through cavalry charges that should have buried them. When the dust settled, the grand army of Armenia and Pontus was gone. Tigranes fled east. Mithridates slipped back into the mountains. The dream of a united Eastern Front died in a single afternoon. Yet the king, as always, refused to die with it. He retreated to the Black Sea, reorganizing what remained of his fleet and army. Lucullus followed, but found himself fighting ghosts. The people of Pontus, who had once hailed Rome's arrival as liberation, now watched the legions with cold eyes. Their patience for conquerors had ended. Ambushes struck supply lines. Roads vanished overnight. Villages that surrendered offered nothing but empty granaries. The war turned into attrition, and attrition favored the land. For 5 years, the struggle continued, a campaign measured not in battles, but in weariness. The king grew thinner, more silent, his court reduced to the hard core of loyal generals and family. The chroniclers of the time describe him riding through snow without escort, stopping at way stations to question garrison captains about rations and morale. He was no longer the youthful conqueror of legend, but something older, harder, almost ascetic. The poisons he had once tested on his body now seemed metaphors for his reign, doses of survival too strong for others to endure. Lucullus, for all his victories, could not finish what he had begun. His legions mutinied, weary of endless marches through mountains and hunger. The Senate, jealous of his success, recalled him to Rome. His enemies whispered that he had grown too rich from plunder, too enamored of Greek luxury. He left Asia reluctantly, his campaign incomplete, his laurels half-earned. The war that was meant to end Mithridates had merely scattered him. In the aftermath, the king sought refuge in the north. He crossed the mountains to the Bosporan kingdom, the distant province his ancestors had bound to Pontus through blood and commerce. There, in the city of Panticapaeum, he rebuilt his base of power. It was an exile of convenience, not defeat. From that fortress on the strait, he ruled the remnants of his realm like a shadow empire, smaller, poorer, but unbroken. As those years of retreat dragged on, legend began to fill the gaps history left behind. Merchants told tales of a monarch who spoke to each soldier by name, who could ride from dawn to dusk without rest, who never slept twice in the same chamber for fear of assassination. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a figure of tragic constancy, a man who had outlasted every enemy but time itself. Even the Romans who hunted him could not deny his endurance. "He is a sickness," one senator wrote, "that returns whenever we believe ourselves cured." By 67 BC, Rome had grown impatient. The Republic appointed Pompey the Great to finish the war once and for all. Lucullus departed. A new predator entered the field. In Panticapaeum, the aging king watched reports of Pompey's march through Armenia and knew the pattern of the end. He had seen it before, in others, never yet in himself. This time, however, there would be no recovery. The machinery of empire had learned his methods. Still, even as the noose tightened, he prepared his defenses with the same methodical calm he had shown at the beginning. Garrisons were strengthened, treasuries hidden, ships refitted. He spoke less, trusted fewer, and watched the horizon as if waiting for something only he could see. The war had lasted half his lifetime. It would not take much longer to consume the rest. The reckoning of Lucullus had not ended in triumph for either side. It had ended in exhaustion, a draw between the patience of a king and the persistence of a republic. Yet for Pontus, even a draw against Rome was victory enough to remember. The empire of the mountains had been wounded, but it still breathed. In that breath lay the final act of defiance. When Lucius Licinius Lucullus returned to Rome in 66 BC, he left behind more dust than conquest. The mountains of Asia still echoed with the noise of his legions, but Pontus had not fallen. The war had become a habit neither side could break, a contest between patience and exhaustion. Rome, weary of delay, turned to a new commander whose name already sounded like destiny. The Senate voted Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, supreme command over the eastern provinces. His orders were unambiguous: end Mithridates. The Republic had learned from its own failures. Pompey did not advance with rhetoric or compromise. He came with 25,000 legionaries, supported by fleets that sealed every harbour from Cilicia to the Euxine. His campaign began not as invasion, but as eclipse. Trade routes went dark. Allies vanished. Messengers failed to return. The world that had once belonged to the king of Pontus began to shrink around him. In the fortress of Panticapaeum, high above the narrow straits of the Crimea, the monarch who had defied Rome for 4 decades studied the reports with the composure of a physician examining his own symptoms. The Roman legions had crossed Armenia, scattering the armies of Tigranes, his last great ally. Cappadocia was lost, Galatia neutral, the coastal cities already flying Roman standards. The empire he had built from patience and fear was unraveling thread by thread. Still, he refused despair. The harbour at Sinop had fallen, but the Bosporan fleet remained loyal. From the sea cliffs, he could watch his ships patrolling the horizon like a remnant of purpose. In council, he spoke not of surrender, but of adaptation. Rome has always mistaken survival for defeat, he told his officers. Let them make that mistake again. They cheered, but their faces betrayed fatigue. For many, the war had outlived its reason. Pompey's legions advanced methodically, establishing garrisons instead of celebrating victories. Each captured city became a fortress, each surrender a new supply depot. The campaign was less conquest than absorption. By the end of 65 BC, the Romans controlled all of Pontus proper. Pompey himself pursued the retreating enemy through Armenia, forcing Tigranes to sue for peace and pay tribute. Only the north, the wild coast of the Black Sea and the Bosporan Peninsula, remained under Pontic command. The king withdrew to his last citadel. He was past 60, lean as a sword and as hard to break. Those who met him in those final years said he moved like a man, half his age, sleeping little, eating sparingly, eyes fixed on maps even while listening to music. He had begun to resemble his own legend, poisoned yet unpoisonable, mortal yet unwilling to die. The courtiers called him the Eternal King now, sometimes in reverence, sometimes in pity. In Panticapaeum, he gathered what forces he could: Bosporan troops, Scythian auxiliaries, and loyal veterans who refused to abandon him. He spoke of marching north through the steppes, of raising new armies from forgotten tribes, of circling back to strike Italy itself. His generals nodded, but privately they counted supplies and wondered what god could conjure another army out of snow and silence. Rebellion came before winter. His own son, Pharnaces, encouraged by Roman envoys, led a mutiny in the capital. Garrisons defected, ships lowered the royal emblem and hoisted the eagle. It was the end that always comes to rulers who outlive their victories, the isolation of genius amid betrayal. The monarch who had commanded kingdoms now found himself surrounded by hesitation. Even the guards at his chamber door avoided his gaze. When the revolt broke into open battle, it lasted less than a day. The army that had followed him through 40 years of endurance now demanded only peace. Pharnaces proclaimed himself king and promised to spare his father's life if he abdicated. No reply came. The old monarch retreated to his private chambers overlooking the straits. Outside, the wind from the Black Sea rose against the windows. Inside, he prepared the last experiment of his long study. For decades, he had tested poisons, cataloguing their effects, seeking the perfect antidote. He had prided himself on his immunity. No venom, no toxin could kill him. Now, for the first time, he regretted it. The draught he drank failed. The body that had survived every attempt on its life refused to obey even its own command. At last, he turned to his guards and asked one of them, a Gallic mercenary named Bituitus, to finish what the poison could not. The soldier hesitated, then obeyed. Thus ended Mithridates of Pontus, the man who had outlasted Alexander's heirs and defied Rome for half a century. When Pompey received the news, he was marching through the mountain passes of Colchis. He ordered the search for the body, and when it was brought to him, allowed it a funeral befitting a king. The corpse was laid in state in Sinope, beneath banners once his own. Even Rome could not deny the magnitude of the enemy it had taken so long to conquer. Pompey reorganized the East with the precision of a surveyor dividing land. Pontus was stripped of its independence, its territories parceled into Roman provinces and client kingdoms. Some lands went to Cappadocian allies, others to the loyal cities of Bithynia. The rest became Pontus et Bithynia, governed by praetors and tax collectors. Roads were rebuilt for legions, not merchants. Temples rededicated to Roman gods. The age of Hellenistic kingship in Anatolia ended with the sound of Roman hammers setting stones. Yet the memory of the king did not vanish. In the villages, old soldiers told stories of the days when Pontus had ruled the seas, and its ruler had defied the invincible West. Poets in Athens and Rhodes wrote of him as both tyrant and hero, an Eastern Achilles undone by time. Even among Romans, his name carried a strange reverence. Pompey himself is said to have kept a ring bearing Mithridates' portrait, a reminder of the only enemy who had forced him to think. The kingdom he left behind was divided, but not erased. In the Bosporan kingdom, his descendants continued to rule as Roman clients, blending the blood of Pontus with that of their conquerors. The star of Mithridates still appeared on their coins, a faint echo of a greater past. The mines still yielded silver. The ports still traded grain. History, as ever, moved on without apology. But in the cliffs above Amasia, the tombs of the early kings still faced the river, their facades weathered but unbroken. Travelers passing through the valley said that on certain evenings, when the wind came down from the north, the carved faces seemed to darken and the air filled with the scent of distant rain. They called it the breath of the old king, restless still, unwilling to sleep. For 4 decades he had forced Rome to look eastward and remember that power is never secure. His death changed nothing in the Roman calendar, yet it marked the end of an age, the last great resistance of the East before the long silence of empire. Once the echoes of conquest died away, the land started to find its own voice once more. Fields that had lain fallow through years of marching and retreat grew over with wild grass. The roads that had echoed with the sound of cavalry filled instead with carts and herds. The air no longer smelled of iron and smoke, but of earth and salt. In that quiet, the kingdom of Pontus learned what it meant to survive without a king. Pompey's legions had passed through like a tide. They left behind the geometry of empire, straight roads where the old ones had curved, bridges that ignored the grain of the valleys, new milestones cut from stone quarried for temples. The banners were gone, but the pattern remained. The provinces of Bithynia and Pontus were joined under a single governor. Cappadocia, Galatia, and Armenia divided what was left. On maps drawn in Rome, the names of cities replaced the names of kings. Where the royal emblem had once marked authority, there was only ink. The transformation was swift, almost surgical. Garrisons replaced fortresses. Tax offices replaced palaces. Greek cities that had once courted the favor of the Mithridates now hurried to welcome Roman law. In Sinop, where the star of Pontus had flown from every mast, magistrates took oaths to the Senate. Amasia, long the heart of the kingdom, became a provincial capital, its royal tombs staring down on the new courthouse. To the citizens who filled its markets, life looked familiar, until they noticed the Latin inscriptions above the doors. Pompey organized the province with the confidence of a man certain that history was a set of ledgers. Grain shipments were calculated, ports registered tonnage, land surveys determined the measure of loyalty. His reforms brought peace of a sort, predictable, dry, heavy with paperwork. Taxes were paid on time, judgments issued without appeal, and ships sailed west bearing the harvests of Anatolia toward an empire that had never seen their fields. Order replaced glory, yet beneath that order, memory moved like groundwater. The people of Pontus had lived under too many banners to mistake silence for submission. In villages high in the Pariadres mountains, shepherds still poured libations to forgotten gods. Sailors in the harbors traced the old star on the prows of their ships before departure, a private insurance against the jealous sea. In Amasia, children learned the story of the king who spoke 20 languages and could not be poisoned. Rome ruled their bodies. Their imaginations belonged to someone else. Even Pompey seemed aware of the contradiction. When the body of Mithridates the Great was brought to him, he ordered honors that bordered on reverence. The funeral pyre burned on a cliff above Sinope, and for one night the harbor filled with ships bearing torches. To the Romans, it was a gesture of magnanimity. To the locals, an admission that a man who had fought them for 40 years deserved something grander than oblivion. The ashes were buried quietly, but the legend was already impossible to contain. Over the next generation, the machinery of empire settled into its rhythm. Governors came from Rome with pomp and returned with profit. The roads grew crowded with caravans, the sea lanes with grain ships bound for the Tiber. The empire had turned what had once been a frontier into a conduit, a place that existed to connect other places. The temples of Mar and Men lost their flames, replaced by marble altars to Jupiter. The language of law became Latin. The language of worship remained Greek. The two blended like sea and river, indistinguishable, restless. From the north came echoes of the old bloodline. Pharnaces, the son who had rebelled, ruled the Bosporan kingdom as a Roman client, his loyalty measured in tribute. For a brief moment during Caesar's wars, he tried to reclaim his father's throne, sweeping south with an army of Scythians and freedmen. He captured cities, struck coins in his own name, and proclaimed the rebirth of Pontus. The dream lasted 5 days. Caesar met him near Zela and destroyed his army before sunset. The Romans' report to the Senate, Veni, Vidi, Vici, was the epitaph of that rebellion and of the age that had made it possible. After Zella, even rebellion learned to behave. Pontus became known not for resistance, but for production. Its mines, its fisheries, its forests. Roman administrators praised its efficiency. Poets praised its beauty. To the west, it was a place of resources. To the people who lived there, it was a landscape haunted by memory. The mountains that had once sheltered armies now hid hermits. The ports that had once built fleets now exported marble and slaves. A kingdom had turned into geography. Even so, Rome's peace, for all its weight, could not extinguish the legend of defiance. Greek historians wrote of the Pontic Wars as the last noble struggle of the East against the arrogance of the West. Roman writers, unable to resist the allure of their enemy, turned the monarch into a moral lesson, a warning about pride, obsession, and the dangers of genius. Both sides misunderstood him, which ensured that he would never be forgotten. By the 1st century AD, the landscape had changed, but the river valleys still carried the same silver light at dusk, and the tombs above Amasia still watched it flow. Travelers wrote of the silence there, how even the birds avoided the cliff face where the kings slept. Some claimed that on stormy nights, the thunder along the Black Sea coast sounded like distant drums, as though the old armies were still on the march. Others said it was only the wind through abandoned watchtowers. Either way, the land remembered the sound of resistance. Rome had conquered Pontus, but it had inherited something more difficult to manage: its imagination. The empire could pave its roads, rename its cities, and tax its harvests, but it could not change the way the people looked at the horizon. For centuries to come, sailors entering the Euxine would still glance toward the east, toward the mountains of Amasia, and think of the king who had once ruled the sea. Across the narrow straits that divide Asia from Europe, another kingdom endured the silence left by Pontus's fall. The Bosporan realm, a crescent of cities strung along the Crimean coast, had once been the farthest edge of Mithridates' empire. Its harbours faced north toward endless steppe, and south toward the familiar haze of Anatolia. Here, the language of Greek traders mingled with that of Scythian horsemen, and the wind smelled of salt and iron. To the Romans, it was a frontier. To those who ruled it, a refuge. The new monarch, Pharnaces II, son of the fallen king, claimed both inheritance and redemption. Rome had spared him after his rebellion. Caesar valued submission more than blood, and granted him the Bosporan kingdom as a client state. It was a compromise born of exhaustion. The Republic would gain a loyal governor, and the son of Mithridates would retain a throne, however diminished. From the marble steps of Panticapaeum, where his father had died, Pharnaces ruled a realm half free, half owned. He governed with the politeness of defeat. Coins minted in his name bore his own image, beside the profile of Julius Caesar, an uneasy duet of faces. His decrees opened with prayers for Rome's prosperity before turning to the business of trade, fortifications, and tax exemptions. The merchants cared little for allegiance so long as commerce flowed. Ships from Delos and Rhodes anchored beside Sarmatian galleys. Bosporan grain, once sold under the Pontic star, now travelled west under Roman contracts. The sea had changed masters, but it had not changed habits. For nearly a century, the Bosporan line endured in this careful balance. Each generation of kings carried the name Mithridates, Pharnaces, or Polemon, alternating between ambition and diplomacy. They ruled by adapting rather than resisting, flattering Roman governors while keeping steppe tribes at bay. Their forts overlooked harbors thick with fog and legends. A poet from Sinope, visiting Panticapaeum, wrote that the palace smelled of pine resin and history. Rome found these northern rulers useful. They guarded the frontier against Sarmatian raids, collected taxes from trade routes along the Maeotic Sea, and sent tribute in gold, slaves, and furs. In return, the empire left them their crowns. Official inscriptions in Latin called them amicus et socius populi Romani, friends and allies of the Roman people. The phrase sounded benign. It meant surveillance disguised as trust. Life along the Bosporan coast was a life of contrasts. The cities glittered with Greek theatres and temples, but a few miles inland, the land belonged to nomads whose gods had no temples at all. Royal processions passed beside herds of wild horses. Senators' envoys dined in halls built of wood and bronze. The rulers of this hybrid world learned to speak with every tongue that wind and fortune carried to their ports. They were heirs to Mithridates, not in power, but in adaptability. Trade remained their bloodstream. Grain from the steppes fed the legions in Syria. Salted fish from the Euxine reached markets as far as Antioch. Amber, slaves, and honey moved south in exchange for olive oil and wine. Each ship that left the Bosporus carried, beneath its cargo, the last vestige of the old Pontic genius, the ability to profit from geography's uncertainty. Every voyage was both commerce and diplomacy. Though centuries softened memory, the name of Mithridates the Great never vanished from their ceremonies. Royal chronicles began with his reign. Court poets invoked him as founder and warning alike. To his descendants, he was the ancestor who had dreamed too greatly and paid too dearly. Their own greatness depended on remembering his limits. Even their piety reflected the duality he had embodied. Altars to Zeus stood beside fire temples dedicated to Iranian deities, long since forgotten elsewhere. In the Bosporan north, the mingling of cultures that had defined Pontus became a way of life, not an experiment. Centuries later, traces of their world would surface, coins stamped with double names, Greek letters beside barbarian signs, tombs holding Roman armor and Scythian gold. To history, they would seem inconsistent. To themselves, they were coherent, a dynasty that had learned to inhabit contradictions rather than die of them. From time to time, rebellions stirred in the south. Governors in Asia demanded higher tribute. A new emperor in Rome questioned the autonomy of the Bosporan line. Each time, diplomacy turned danger into survival. Letters written in impeccable Latin arrived in the imperial court, praising the emperor's wisdom and enclosing gifts that proved gratitude better than loyalty ever could. Rome, busy elsewhere, nodded and forgot. The north went on ruling itself under the guise of obedience. In the 1st century A.D., under Queen Dynamis and her successors, the Bosporan kingdom reached a quiet prosperity. The ports bustled, fortresses guarded mountain passes. Scholars from Athens visited to lecture in Greek schools funded by royal endowments. The empire called it a success story, an example of barbarian enlightenment under Roman supervision. The truth was simpler. The descendants of Mithridates had turned submission into art. Time eroded the sharp edges of the old struggle. The republic that had destroyed Pontus was itself gone, replaced by emperors who ruled as kings without admitting it. In this new world, the Bosporan rulers looked less like clients and more like reflections. They built statues of Augustus beside those of their ancestors. They celebrated Roman victories as their own. The empire had absorbed its former enemies so completely that it could no longer tell where conquest ended and inheritance began. Still, echoes of independence remained. During festivals, minstrels recited songs of the ancient kingdom by the Black Sea, of the monarch who had defied Rome and spoken to the stars. The verses were old, the rhythms uncertain, but the pride in the listeners' faces was unmistakable. The story had outlasted the empire that tried to bury it. It had become not a rebellion, but a memory, and memory needs no army. Years drifted by. Rome's strength dimmed. The Bosporan kingdom, nominally loyal, remained one of the last Hellenistic states on earth. Even in the 3rd century AD, its kings still called themselves Basileus in Greek inscriptions and ruled from palaces filled with relics of older ages, Persian jewelry, Macedonian helmets, Pontic coins worn smooth from generations of handling. Their realm was smaller now, their titles less certain, but the continuity was undeniable. They were the proof that survival can be its own victory. When the historians of later ages searched for the traces of the kingdom of Pontus, they found not ruins, but descendants. Through the long winters of Crimea, through the quiet centuries of Roman decline, the blood of the Mithridatids persisted in names, in rituals, in the way a sailor might still offer wine to the sea before departing. In their endurance lay the faint echo of the man who had first taught them that survival is a form of conquest. Far to the south, in the hills above Amasia, the carved tombs still faced the river. The empire had changed, the rulers forgotten, but the wind from the Black Sea reached even there. It carried the smell of salt and the faintest whisper of language older than Latin, older than empire, a whisper of ships, of patience, of a dynasty that refused to vanish. The sound was not triumph and not mourning, only continuity, the sea remembering its own reflection. The old frontiers of Pontus faded without ceremony. On imperial maps, the province was a simple outline, labeled in Latin, no more or less remarkable than its neighbors. The name no longer meant a kingdom, only an administrative district, a line on parchment governed from afar. What the Romans could not erase, time absorbed. Centuries of imperial order settled over the Black Sea coast like silt. Legionaries became settlers. Fortresses turned into towns. The roads built by Pompey's engineers grew into the trade arteries of the Eastern Empire. The old capitals, Amasia, Sinope, Amisos, learned the habits of permanence. Markets filled again, taxes were collected. Festivals resumed their cycles. The world no longer lived in the rhythm of conquest, but in the steadier pulse of empire. Under Trajan, the Roman frontier pushed east into Armenia and Mesopotamia, and the province of Pontus became a corridor rather than a border. The emperor's legions passed through on their way to Parthia, leaving behind roads and milestones carved with his name. Veterans retired along the rivers, building villas with Roman courtyards beside Anatolian hearths. Latin mingled with Greek, then softened into the dialect that would survive for 1,000 years. The locals began to call themselves not Persians or Hellenes, but simply Romans, a name that had become an empire's common tongue. In the 3rd century AD, the illusion of stability broke for the first time. Armies of Goths swept down from the north, crossing the Black Sea in ships stolen or built in haste. They plundered Trebizond, Sinope, and the coastal towns, vanishing into the mountains before legions could respond. Smoke rose where temples had stood. Inscriptions were left unfinished. For the people of Pontus, it was a cruel repetition, a reminder that peace was only another kind of intermission. But the empire endured. Diocletian's reforms in the late 200s AD divided the provinces again, tightening control and multiplying governors. Pontus Galaticus, Pontus Polemoniacus, Pontus Cappadocicus, names that read like variations on a memory. The imperial bureaucracy, indifferent to nostalgia, turned geography into accounting. Yet even as it categorized, it preserved. The land was still called Pontus. The word, stripped of its crown, had survived the kings who coined it. Religion, too, began to shift. Christianity, once hunted, took root in the valleys. By the 4th century AD, bishops from Amasia and Sinope attended councils alongside those of Antioch and Constantinople. The gospel spread along the same trade routes that had once carried Mithridates' decrees. Temples became churches. Altars to Zeus and Ma were rededicated to saints who, in their miracles and tempers, resembled the gods they replaced. Faith changed, but the landscape remained recognizable, a place of crossings where East and West still negotiated meaning. In this new world, the empire's attention shifted. Rome itself was fading. Constantinople was rising. The Black Sea, once the edge of empire, became its interior. Soldiers from Pontus served in imperial armies. Officials from its towns governed provinces far away. The people of the mountains were no longer subjects of distant rulers. They had become the distant rulers themselves. Empire had absorbed them as it absorbed everything, quietly, thoroughly, without apology. The 4th and 5th centuries. AD passed in layers of adaptation. Earthquakes shook the coast, invasions pressed from the steppe, trade ebbed and returned. Through it all, Pontus learned endurance anew. Amasia remained a seat of bishops. Sinope, rebuilt after Gothic raids, became a naval base. The mines of the Periadres Mountains still yielded silver for the emperor's coinage. The land had changed masters, gods, and alphabets, but its labor continued as it always had. In the Byzantine centuries that followed, Pontus acquired new titles. Under Constantine, it belonged to the Diocese Pontica. Under Justinian, it was folded into the Thema Armeniacon, a military province designed to defend Anatolia's eastern flank. The language of command was Greek now, but the habits of survival were still Anatolian. Soldiers stationed along the Halys knew the same mountain passes their ancestors had guarded under Mithridates, though they marched for emperors who had forgotten the name. Urban life adapted to Christian rhythm. Churches rose where fortresses had decayed, their domes reflecting the light of the Black Sea. The monasteries founded by Basil the Great in the 4th century became models of discipline and charity, drawing pilgrims from as far as Syria. The monks wrote in Greek but kept the austerity of the old Anatolian ascetics. Their chants filled valleys once known for war. The mountains that had echoed with the tramp of armies now resonated with prayer. Trade tied the region to the wider empire. Timber, honey, and iron traveled south to Constantinople. Silks and spices from the east arrived through Trebizond. Merchants still blessed their voyages with gestures older than Christianity, pouring a drop of wine to the sea before departure, a custom the bishops tolerated without comment. Every ritual carried a trace of something older, as if the past refused to leave entirely. By the 7th century AD, the land of Pontus had become an inseparable part of the Byzantine world. Its soldiers fought Arabs on the Taurus frontier. Its monasteries copied scriptures that would later define theology. The empire called them Romans now, and they accepted the name without irony. The difference between conqueror and conquered had blurred. The empire that had destroyed Mithridates had become, in a sense, his heir. Eastern, multi-ethnic, stubbornly alive. Centuries passed, and memory folded itself into legend. The old tombs above Amasia remained, their faces worn smooth by wind and time. Locals said they belonged to giants or to kings who would rise again at the world's end. Travelers from Constantinople stopped to carve their own names into the stone, adding new alphabets to old. History, once written in blood and decree, now existed as rumor carried by pilgrims. Pontus had finally integrated without vanishing. Its people spoke Greek, prayed to Christ, and served Byzantine emperors. Yet in their festivals and songs, fragments of older faiths survived. At weddings, they lit fires and circled them 3 times, invoking both blessing and protection. The mountains still dictated their seasons. The sea still dictated their trade. Identity here was sedimentary, layer upon layer, each too deep to remove without collapsing the rest. As the 9th century unfolded, the wars of Mithridates had vanished from the empire's memory, though the land still whispered them, in stone, in prayer, in name. The people of Pontus had outlasted every conqueror, not by defiance, but by absorption. Their history had become their architecture, built, rebuilt, and still standing. The kingdom was gone, but the place remained faithful to its oldest instinct, to endure without surrender, to change without disappearing. Where kings once ruled and legions marched, the bells of monasteries now marked the hours. Between their echoes, if one listened closely enough, the wind carried a sound almost like the surf against the cliffs of Sinope, a reminder that even empires, like tides, retreat but never forget the shore. By the time the Roman Empire turned into Byzantium, the mountains of Pontus had already learned to speak the language of faith. The old gods had retreated into legend, and the shrines of Ma and Men stood empty beneath the vines. In their place rose chapels of pale stone and mosaics the color of sunlight on water. The region had not forgotten how to worship. It had simply changed its direction. Christianity had reached the Black Sea coast early, carried by merchants and refugees long before it found imperial favor. When Constantine the Great legalized the new religion in 313 AD, Pontus was already full of hermits living in caves above the rivers, and of small congregations meeting in the ruins of temples. Within a generation, the change became irreversible. The faith that once thrived in secrecy now built its own architecture. Crosses replaced fire altars. Processions replaced sacrifices. The same valleys that had echoed with war cries began to hum with hymns. Far from the capital, the region became a cradle of theology. From Caesarea of Cappadocia came the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, whose writings would define Christian doctrine for centuries. Basil, born in nearby Pontic lands, founded monastic communities that balanced labor with prayer. His rules transformed solitude into discipline, giving the Byzantine Church its most enduring order. The monasteries that followed his example clung to the cliffs like fortresses, their bells replacing the sound of centuries' horns. Within their walls, the empire's most fragile inheritance, books, languages, and the idea of reason, survived the tempests of history. The geography that had once protected armies now sheltered faith. Streams that once filled moats now supplied cisterns. Mountain caves became chapels. Pilgrims from as far as Antioch and Jerusalem traveled north to see these sanctuaries. The monks welcomed them with quiet hospitality and sent them home with copies of sacred texts. In these hills, parchment replaced bronze as the material of empire. In the coastal cities, Roman order softened into Byzantine rhythm. The port of Sinope, rebuilt after centuries of war, became a station for the imperial fleet and a haven for merchants from across the Black Sea. Its walls glittered with churches instead of armories, their domes tiled in green and gold. Amisos and Trebizond flourished under the same wind that once carried Mithridates' ships. Grain and wine still filled the holds of cargo vessels, but now they sailed under banners bearing the cross instead of the star of Pontus. The merchants made the sign of blessing before casting off, as if the sea still required tribute before granting passage. Art and scholarship flowered in this unlikely frontier. Mosaics in the churches of Amasia showed saints with faces carved from local stone, stern and weathered as the mountains themselves. Illuminated manuscripts, copied by patient hands, carried the thought of Athens and Antioch into a new age. The region became known not for rebellion, but for learning. Even in Constantinople, scholars spoke of Pontic monasteries as places where the empire's memory was written line by line against forgetting. Imperial authority reached these valleys mostly through symbols. Governors came and went, collecting taxes and issuing decrees, but it was the bishops who truly ruled. Their authority rested not on legions, but on literacy, and the people trusted them as mediators between heaven and the distant court. In the 5th century AD, bishops from Amasia and Trebizond signed their names to the canons of Chalcedon, binding the Pontic churches to the theology of the capital. The connection was spiritual as much as political. Byzantium's empire was no longer of borders, but of belief. For all the serenity, the region was never far from danger. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab fleets crossed the Black Sea, raiding the coastal towns. They burned monasteries and carried off captives, but the land refused to stay silent for long. Each invasion left behind scars that healed into churches, rebuilt with the same stones that had fallen. The emperors in Constantinople fortified the northern coast, and the Pontic theme, a military administrative province, took shape. Soldiers drilled on the same fields where Mithridates' armies had once mustered, and monks prayed for them from nearby cloisters. Faith and defense had become two parts of the same vocation. Inland, the mountains preserved an older rhythm of life. Villages clung to ridges where no road reached, their houses built from basalt and pine. Farmers ploughed terraces first cut in the age of the kings, and shepherds drove their flocks along paths marked by weathered stones, whose inscriptions no one could read. The people spoke Greek, touched by the echoes of Persian and Anatolian tongues, a dialect that belonged entirely to the place. The empire called them Pontic Romans. They called themselves simply ourselves. Travelers who journeyed through Pontus during these centuries described it as a land where time behaved differently. In the cities, one could see the latest art from Constantinople. In the mountains, the past lingered like mist. Pagan ruins were left standing beside monasteries, not from reverence, but from habit. The people of the highlands saw no contradiction in tending both. They understood that endurance does not require purity, only persistence. By the reign of Justinian the Great in the 6th century AD, the empire's attention turned once again toward infrastructure. Engineers built new fortifications along the coast, repaired the harbors, and improved the roads linking Pontus to Armenia and the Caucasus. The emperor's building projects were as much spiritual as strategic. Churches crowned the hills, their domes glinting like signal fires above the valleys. His codes of law reached even the smallest villages, written in Greek on public tablets for all to see. Empire had become a habit of reading. Over time, the monasteries became the region's real archives. They stored not only scripture, but memory, documents of land grants from forgotten emperors, records of plagues, fragments of poetry, and the correspondence of bishops. When the capital burned or changed rulers, The mountain libraries of Pontus remained untouched. A scribe's steady hand became more enduring than marble. The words of the fathers outlived the noise of empire. The years passed quietly, marked more by earthquakes than by wars. The people rebuilt what fell, as they always had. From generation to generation, they looked out on the same sea, trusting neither conquest nor peace too deeply. The Black Sea gave as much as it took. It carried the ships of invaders and the blessings of trade alike. To live there was to understand that history's rhythm was not progress, but return. By the 10th century AD, the Byzantine world was strong again, and Pontus had become one of its most devout provinces. Pilgrims traveled to the monasteries of the Pontic Alps, where relics of saints were said to work quiet miracles. In Trebizond, scholars copied Aristotle beside the Gospels, proof that reason and faith could share the same page. The sea glittered with commerce. The hills glowed with prayer. It was a civilization at peace with its contradictions. Nothing of the old kingdom remained except geography and temperament. The mountains were the same, the rivers unchanged, the people still cautious, proud, and patient. They no longer spoke of Mithridates as a man, only as an ancestor of endurance. His wars had turned into parables told by monks to explain why defiance, like virtue, must sometimes hide itself to survive. The empire that had once feared him now claimed his land as its own heartland, proof that even rebellion could be woven into the story of salvation. As decades shifted, Pontus continued to face the sea with the same expression, watchful, enduring, unyielding to definition. It had outlasted kings and conquerors, gods and empires, and now it outlasted memory itself. Its faith was no longer the faith of resistance, but of constancy. The land had become what its people always were, a quiet promise that nothing truly vanishes, only changes its form. The cliffs above the Iris River have kept their vigil for more than 2,000 years. From the valley below, the tombs of the kings still catch the evening light, their carved faces fading into the stone they were meant to conquer. Nothing moves there except the wind and the occasional hawk circling where banners once flew. The voices that once ruled these valleys are gone, yet the silence they left behind sounds strangely deliberate, as though the land itself were continuing the conversation. Below those cliffs, the river winds through orchards and villages that have forgotten their own antiquity. Farmers still turn the same soil that fed Mithridates' soldiers. Fishermen still mend their nets in the shadow of the same mountains. They no longer know the names of the gods who once guarded these waters, but they inherit their patience. The people of the Black Sea coast have learned to live with history, the way one lives with weather, expected, endured, occasionally kind. In the cities, traces of empire linger, like inscriptions worn smooth by touch. Streets follow Roman geometry. Churches rise from the foundations of temples older than the alphabet. Amasia, once the seat of a king, now hums with the same quiet commerce that has always fed it. Merchants trade timber and salt. Scholars study in the cool rooms of Byzantine monasteries that still smell faintly of smoke. Even without its crown, the land carries itself like a kingdom. Mithridates has become a story rather than a man. In local tales, he is both hero and warning, an immortal who could not die, a rebel who mistook endurance for destiny. Children hear of him as the king who spoke to poisons and survived, as though resistance itself were a form of prayer. He belongs less to history than to imagination. An imagination, unlike empire, cannot be conquered. Every empire that claimed this coast has left something behind. The Persians gave its order, the Greeks its language, Rome its discipline, Byzantium its faith. Each believed it had remade the land, and each was mistaken. Pontus accepted every inheritance and outlived every owner. Its genius was never conquest. It was absorption. To endure without losing shape, to change without breaking. This was the quiet art that no invader ever understood. The sea keeps the memory better than any chronicle. On calm days, it reflects the sky with such precision that horizon and water vanish. Sailors say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the creak of ancient ships beneath the waves, the fleets of the king who defied the world. It may be only wind and current, but in this place, echoes have weight. They are another kind of history, the one that refuses to be written down. Travelers who come to these shores often sense the presence of something they cannot name. They walk the old roads between ruined fortresses, feel the cool air that flows down from the Pontic Alps, and realize that the landscape itself remembers. Stones keep the outline of vanished walls. Terraces follow the pattern of forgotten fields. Even the monasteries built by later ages seem to borrow their gravity from a kingdom that never truly disappeared, only changed its language of survival. The legend of Pontus is not one of triumph, but of continuity. Its people have lived under 100 flags and have learned that none of them last. What endures are the patterns of the land, the rhythm of the tides, the flight of birds over the valleys, the labor of hands that rebuild what falls. History here is less a record than a heartbeat, steady and indifferent to the empires it outlives. At dusk, the light over the Black Sea turns the color of old bronze. Fishermen steer homeward, their nets heavy with the evening's catch. The monasteries along the cliffs begin their vespers. The chant rises and mingles with the wind, a sound older than the faith that carries it. For a moment, the air feels full of memory, not of battles or crowns, but of persistence. The same persistence that once guided a king who believed he could stand against the world and, in his own way, did. Pontus has long since ceased to be a kingdom, but the idea of it endures. A place where east meets west and neither wins, where empires fade, but the land remains loyal to itself. Its story is less about loss than inheritance. Every conqueror who came here left something behind, and the land wove it all together into a single, patient identity. There are few monuments to the old kings now, but the sea remains, and the mountains, and the stubborn calm of the people who live between them. They do not speak of Mithridates, yet in their endurance he is still alive. His empire of will has become theirs, and as the wind rises again from the north, the cliffs above Amasia catch the last light of the day. The stone faces almost human for a moment, as if remembering.